Happy July. With a new month comes new laws in effect in our state. Probably one of the biggest that passed during the legislative session and goes into effect is our 2-year $55.8 billion state budget. And while there are a lot of great things that came out of it, certainly the Republican Party thought that there was a lot of unnecessary spending. You know, what I think is interesting, though, is just about a week or so ago, an article knowing that the budget was going to go into effect July 1st, highlighted that there was about $190 million more in revenue for our state that was not discovered until after the budget was already passed. And so here we are. I would love to talk about this a little bit more. We've got House Minority Leader Vin Candelora back on the show with us. Representative Candelora, always appreciate your time. $190 million? What?
Yeah, kind of amazing. And what was interesting is, Keith Faniff, who's a reporter from the Mirror, did a study of it, and it seems under Governor Lamont's term, we average somewhere around, I think it was $240 million a year of revenue that comes in after the budget's passed.
Yeah, I'm reading it right here. It says over the past 7 years, Lamont's budget office has upgraded revenue estimates an average of $285 million. You were lowballing them. $285 million in the first 2.5 months after lawmakers leave the Capitol. How does that happen?
Well, essentially, we try to get it right. So we have a consensus revenue process every quarter, which is done with our nonpartisan office and the governor's office, and they get together and try to determine what revenue is going to look like. And, they landed on these numbers back in April thinking this is where we're going to be. But obviously things can improve or things could get worse, and they do change. I guess there is sort of an accusation that maybe the governor's office is lowballing these numbers and trying to be more conservative. And in the meantime, it does impact the budget process. So there is some level of subjectivity to it. I think there's usually about a 3% derivation in the past that we've seen. So while the number seems high, it's hard to figure out how to avoid this from happening.
Right. And maybe I'm crazy, but I feel like earlier this year, like during the session, didn't we also have money sort of surprisingly pop up?
Yeah.
Right? I'm not insane, right?
You're not. You're 100% correct. And that money popped up in a little different way. The governor's office found $340 million of interest that was accumulated from the COVID money at the federal level that was given to us. And so that money sort of appeared in perfect timing in order to do the budget. And I was certainly critical of the way they pulled that money out of the couch cushions and had it hidden all these years. So, the legislature needs to do its due diligence. I think the lesson to be learned from Democrats in the legislature is just because the governor shares the same party affiliation as you, his motives are very different. He's the one that has to administer these agencies and actually make it work. And the legislature wants to fulfill promises, so that the motives are a little bit different. And I think the legislature just needs to do more due diligence when they're budgeting.
Yeah, no question. And again, we have House Minority Leader Vin Candelora here. And, going back to what was highlighted recently in the Connecticut Mirror, now we've got some $190 million in revenue that, again, is not being appropriated into the budget, which is now in effect. So what do you do with that money? And who decides on where that money goes now? Does it just sit in the rainy day fund? Does it just sort of get decided from the governor and other state leader? Like, what do you do with that money now?
Yeah, I think what it does is for this budget year, starting actually today, for the next 12 months, that money will sit in what's called the unappropriated surplus. So that'll be tracked as part of our surplus revenue. When we go into session next year, the legislature can then, allocate it. So they could allocate it to debt service, they could allocate it to the rainy day fund, or they could spend it if we're under the spending cap. They could, allocate that money to certain needs. I do think Medicaid, for instance, needs to be reformed those rates need to be increased, so they could use it for those rate increases.
Which I believe when the governor came on our show, Representative Candelora, he had said, by August or so, he said we're probably going to have to go. This was before House Bill 5002 and a special session that's happening in the fall now. He had said we're probably going to have to convene sometime over the summertime specifically for that. And so maybe that is where that money goes.
It probably will. Like right now, the budget we know is out of whack by $85 million because they over budgeted the hospital tax. So they pegged that number at $375 million for taxes on hospitals. The hospital says you're way off. It needs to be closer to $285 million. So I think that difference is going to have to be made up, and that surplus will probably be used to make up that difference.
Okay. And when we talk about, that happening, if they were to use that money again, would that be a decision that comes from the governor solely? Would this be something that he talks to, certain leaders about? Who decides that?
So it would have to be legislated. So it would have to be the governor, could certainly propose it. The legislature would have to draft a bill and pass it through the assembly, like any other piece of legislation, and the governor would have to sign it to put it into law. So it would have to be both branches of government that would come to an agreement.
Okay. So are we looking at potentially 2 special sessions? I mean, that might be a question for the governor, but now to figure out what to do with this $190 million. And then obviously we've got the special session in either late September or early October for House Bill 5002 with the housing crisis. Are we looking at now potentially lawmakers having to go back to Hartford for 2 different sessions?
Yeah, they would probably be done on the same day.
Oh, okay.
And I think they would both happen, in tandem, probably in the fall. Like I said, there needs to be budget adjustments. Number one, depending on what the federal government does with their budget, we're going to have to react to that. But I also think there's some deficiencies that we already have to react to regardless. So certainly we'll be in there for the budget changes. And then if the housing bill, gets negotiated, we may go in to have a do-over for the housing bill and take that up in the fall as well.
And really quick, Representative Candelora, when you come across, again, it feels like deja vu, but when you keep hearing about very high estimates of more revenue that's discovered after the fact, do you feel like there needs to either be, we have to look at our systems, how we're doing things? Do we need better oversight for the Appropriations Committee, for example? I mean, where are we falling short with this? I think, more and more people are becoming aware of what's happening up in Hartford, the average Connecticut resident, and they're asking, regardless of their political affiliation, how does this happen? I mean, both Democrats and Republicans seemed like in that article, they were outraged about that revenue.
Yeah, we need a Ways and Means Committee, which is, we have a finance committee that determines the revenue. We have an appropriations committee that determines the spending, and they never come together. We need a sort of a Ways and Means Committee that's going to take the spending bill and the revenue bill and put it together and balance a budget. I think if we had that type of a process, you would have that committee reviewing the revenue to make sure we get it right. And I think that Connecticut really falls short in not doing that because you end up in a back room having a few people making determinations of what a final budget is going to look like. And I think that's where these mistakes are made. So I think we're better served with having a Ways and Means Committee at the legislative process and doing this in a more transparent way. Yeah. But I'm not sure I'll win that argument.
Well, Representative Candelora, you are more than welcome to share your arguments here on WICC, and I appreciate you giving us the time to talk about this.